Hello, everybody, and welcome to another wonderful session on the Sustainability Summit here at Sustainable Jersey. Today, we're going to be talking about NNOCCI's Climate Interpreter Program, a program that Cassie's going to tell you a little bit more about that'll help you with your interpersonal interactions in terms of talking about climate change in small audiences and decision makers. Before we get started, I'm going to go over a couple housekeeping items. If you are new to Zoom, these are some of the features, although it's been almost a year, so I think everyone's very familiar with Zoom, but if you have some things you want to comment about the presentation or chime in, you can use the chat feature. If you have some questions that we can answer at the end, you can type them into the questions box. We have a new feature with Zoom. It's a live transcript subtitle setting. If you do not wish to see this, you can remove those settings from your view using this live transcript feature at the bottom of your screen. Some announcements, the next deadlines for submission for certification. The first deadline is June 6th for municipal certification and June 21st for the final school certification deadline. If you are interested in getting some free technical assistance for your community to develop a water story, the new action in the municipal program related to water gold, brand new. You can find out more about that in the Sustainable Jersey website under the grants portal. And then we also have another opportunity for $75,000 in grants for resiliency and environmental stewardship projects for municipalities in the Atlantic City electric territory. So now I'm going to turn it over to Cassie, who's going to tell you about her exciting program. She is a volunteer with NNOCCI, and they do an extensive climate interpreter training program. She's going to give you the very brief version today, and hopefully that will encourage you to reach out and get involved with their training program to gain some resources to help you be more effective in your community. Cassie.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So hi, everybody. Can't see any of you, but feel free to type into the chat box at any point if you have any questions during the presentation. And like it was mentioned, we're going to be talking about how to communicate about climate change. So I am based in West Palm Beach, Florida currently, but I grew up in New Jersey. I am a born and raised in Teaneck, New Jersey, in Bergen County, and went to high school in Franklin Lakes, Oakland area. So I'm excited to be here today. And NNOCCI is the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. It is a network, as listed in the name, of people who care about communicating about climate change. But we will talk about that more in just a little bit. So if you do have any questions along the way, please feel free to type them into the chat box, and I will address them as I can. We'll have some time for questions at the end as well. So what are we doing today? We're going to talk about why we need to talk about climate change and why we need to tell a different story. We'll talk about NNOCCI, what it is, and strategic framing, which you'll hear me reference a lot. The elements of an impactful climate story and how to stay connected with NNOCCI as well. So this is a very, very, very brief introduction to what we do in communicating climate change with NNOCCI. But I will give you some more details on how you can stay connected with us and learn more if you're interested. So we know through research that 72% of Americans think climate change is happening now. That may sound like a really big number to some of you, depending on the kind of conversations you've been having recently, but that is the data. That's what it tells us. 72% think it's happening now, but 59% of Americans rarely or never discuss it. So we have a little bit of a disconnect between people feeling like this is a thing that's happening, but they're not talking about it. So we're here to help change that story and make it a little bit easier for people to feel like they can have an effective communication about climate change. And the way that we do that is we really promote hope and solutions. So we know that hopeful individuals are more likely to talk to their friends and family about climate change. They're more likely to support regulating carbon dioxide and say that they're going to do something about it. And discussing it, the reason why we want people to talk about climate change, leads to greater acceptance of climate science and therefore leads to more solutions and more community-based solutions. So feeling hopeful is really, really important in that first step of wanting to talk, caring, and feeling like you can do something to change it. So Noki originally started through a grant that wanted to put us in informal science education centers. So those were places like zoos and aquariums, national parks, museums, things like that. Since that initial grant has now run out, we're definitely starting to branch out more and talk to people who do all sorts of communication, even if it's just communication with your friends and family or people you meet throughout your day. I had a climate change conversation at the gym this morning with some of the people we work out with in the morning and came up in conversation. So though our data on this slide is about informal science learning, it's about everybody. If you happen to be part of an informal science learning center, we know that 61% of the US population visits informal science learning centers. We know that 327.5 million people attend national parks every year. And we know that, especially with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the AZA, those institutions see 183 million people a year. That is more than all of the major sports combined. So those people definitely have a reach. So we have a lot of people we can start talking to, and it's important that we use the same language in order to do that. All right, so NOCCI, the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, has a mission. Together we can train enough voices in proven communication techniques to shift the national conversation about climate change to be more productive, civic-minded, and solutions-focused. So the whole point of what we do is to teach people to talk about climate change so that we're able to have positive conversations, effective communications, and we really want to focus on those community level solutions. We'll talk about how to do that in just a little bit. So here's how we do that. We take climate scientists, educators of all sorts, and social scientists and put them together and create the climate communicator, which I like to define a climate communicator as anybody who effectively communicates about climate. So that can be those climate scientists, it could be social scientists, it could be educators, it could be anybody. Anybody you're talking to, you can be a climate communicator. So over the last 10 years, NOCCI now represents 38 states. We have representatives in 38 states, about 200 institutions, which is a difficult number to tack down these days as COVID kind of displaced a lot of us in informal science learning. And over 500 now trained members on communicating climate science. I did my study circle in 2014. The very first one was in 2010. And the most recent one study circle was 2019. And we're hoping to bring study circles back soon. As soon as we can safely meet in person again, we'll have study circles again. So we want to take all of those people, all of that information, combine it into climate science. We know it works because we're scientists, so we tested it. And we know that NOCCI trained communicators, the communicators themselves leave that conversation with a higher level of hope for the future, but the people they're talking to also do. So both the communicator and the person who is a part of that conversation are able to leave that conversation with a greater sense of hope and feeling like they have an ability to change and do something about climate change, which is very important. So where do we start? Knowing how people think is important. This is where social science comes into to help us construct and deliver our message for the highest impact. So we do it ourselves all the time as educators of all sorts, or even when you're talking to people in your everyday lives. We forget that other people have different ideas or different places that they're starting from. They have different things inside their head, but we also share a lot of those things too. And we want to make sure that we kind of start where people start, or at least we understand where they're starting in a conversation, so we can guide them through that conversation in a productive manner. All right, so if you do a Google search for the word ocean in images, obviously, this is what pops up. What are some of the commonalities that you notice about these pictures? You are welcome to type them into, I guess, the Q&A box or the chat box. Yeah, so you're able to type into the chat box as well. Let's see what we say. Crystal clear water. It's blue. Lots of blue, lots of blue, lots of water. There's no people. They're all beautiful. Yeah, definitely. It shows the ocean in pristine condition. There's no pollution. Definitely. The water's moving. It's not in my community. It's not here. There were reflections. Yeah, all of these things that we're noticing about these images. It doesn't really look like this. It's not, doesn't look like the New Jersey ocean. Doesn't look like down the shore. Yeah, I would agree with that. It's huge. It's so big. We can't see the other side of it. It's just so much water. No signs of any problems. Yep, just water. Awesome. So a lot of these ideas that we're coming up with are similar. There's a lot of blue. It looks pristine. It looks really big. There's no pollution, no people, no signs of harm, no signs of problems. There's a lot of it. And you may have noticed there's a couple of whales in there. There's some coral and fish in one of those images, but for the most part, it's just water. There's some what we like to call charismatic megafauna in the informal science world. They're all floating around in there. So this is what we refer to as a cultural model, or anthropologists have coined this term. Cultural models are widely shared. So a lot of people have these same ideas. They're very durable. It's hard to get rid of them. They stick. They're in there. They structure thinking. And there are multiple cultural models on any one issue. So when I use the word ocean, these images are what a lot of people come up with initially. So I say something like, what we do affects the ocean, or there's a lot of problems that are happening in the ocean. That doesn't always compute, because this is what you're thinking. So what we do is we take these cultural models and we can utilize them for talking about climate change. Lost my mouse with the chat box. All right, we're going to use that chat box again. Just like there's default thinking on the ocean, there are default thinking or cultural models on climate change or carbon dioxide. So these images on the screen are just funny little cartoons. Why don't the greenhouse gases escape through the hole in the ozone layer? And my desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. So things that we hear sometimes when we talk about climate change. What are some of the more common misconceptions that you hear about climate change? Feel free to type those into the chat box as well. Forgot to mention, we like to be interactive, so we're going to keep your fingers busy at least. We can't see your faces. It's inevitable. Yeah. It's blown out of proportion. It's not based on facts. It's too difficult to do anything about it. You can't do anything about it. It's always changing. It's natural. It doesn't apply to me. It's always been happening. We hear a lot of ozone. Yeah. Hot summers, cold winters, storms, it's always been there. It's overwhelming. Global warming, but it's so cold outside. It definitely can't be warming if it's cold, right? We'll solve it eventually. Somebody will get to it. Yeah. These are definitely all things that I've heard as well. The government will take care of it, whatever that means. Yeah, what we do won't make a difference because other countries won't do it either. That was part of our conversation this morning as well. Oh, maybe if we do things, China won't. Yeah, what can we do about it? So all of these things are things that we hear about climate change on a regular basis. And these are all part of the cultural model of climate change. But the bottom line is, if people don't know what carbon dioxide gas is or what climate change is or what role the ocean plays in the climate, they're not going to be able to come up with solutions or feel hopeful that we can even solve this problem together. So we're going to address that problem. And Frameworks Institute, who we work with, they're part of our social science team, has developed what my favorite part of Noki is the swamp. And it is basically a map of the cultural models associated with climate change. And as being part of this presentation, you get to go home with your very own swamp today. We will leave you bringing gifts or with gifts. So this is the swamp of oceans and climate, or ocean and climate. It's in a couple of different buckets. So things like ocean, science, consumerism, pollution. These are all different buckets of those. And each of those words is a cultural model there. So a couple of words, maybe a phrase or two. You may notice that they're different colors, and I apologize for anybody who can't differentiate color, but towards the bottom of every bucket are some red phrases, cultural models. Those are ones that we hear, and some of them may look familiar to you who are participating in the chat box, but they're not productive in a conversation. Either they're inaccurate or they're leading to unproductive thought process. The yellow ones are okay. They tend to be in the middle. They're not the worst, but they're not the best. Proceed with caution. The green ones, there's usually just one or two of those at the top. Those are the ones that we want to steer people towards. So when we go through a full Noki training, we talk about, we have a tool called bridging and pivoting, or we like to call it bridging, where we talk about how to navigate through the swamp. But just by using a couple of tools that you're going to learn today, you'll be able to effectively manage this swamp. And how you do that is a method we call strategic framing. So you don't have to memorize the swamp. We will refer back to it, and you will get your own that you can play with at any given time. All right, so strategic framing is what we're using in order to formulate an effective communication. Strategic framing is a research-based approach. A lot of research went into this approach, and it helps bridge the gap between scientists and public understanding. Scientists do their jobs very, very well, but they're not always the best at communicating. And I think we especially observed this through the pandemic, how the perception from the public was so different and varied, partially because they weren't all getting the information in a way that they could understand or in a way that spoke to their prior knowledge. So we want to bridge that gap. We want to make sure that the scientists can talk about their science in a way that people understand. We want to help the public understand the mechanisms of climate change, show how you can be heroes of your own climate story, and you want everybody to leave this communication with a sense of hope, and that's very important. So we do that by navigating through a very simple story. We have a three-part story. We're going to say, why does this matter to society? How does it work? And how do we improve the situation? So we're going to work through this story together. And if we do it effectively, we're going to use a reasonable tone throughout too. When people come running up to you and going, climate change is real and we're all gonna die, it doesn't really work as well as if you sound like you're a reasonable person. So again, recently we've heard, especially from the younger communities, a lot of crisis-y tones, which work in the immediate. But climate change is a long-term problem, which means we're going to have to be invested in it for the long term. And using a step-by-step reasonable tone and approach is going to have a longer lasting effect than sparking somebody into crisis in the moment. If you want somebody to donate money to your organization right now, crisis is great. But if you want somebody to make reasonable steps and approaches to addressing a long-term problem, then it's time to scale back the crisis. So we're going to start with, why does this matter to society? This is the first part of the story, and you really want to start cluing people into, why does this matter? Why is it important? Why should you care? If you don't do that, they're going to tune you out. If you just start going off on your soapbox, and I'm sure we've all experienced it on both ends of the spectrum. So make sure that you understand that you connect people to why it matters. It's a common trap to assume that people care about the same things you do in the same way. So while saving money is really important to me, it might not be important to somebody who has a lot of money or doesn't use their own money or just really could care less about money. So we want to find values that are widely shared and bring up this idea that we want to care and protect our planet from harm. So we did some research, and we've come up with 2 values that are widely shared across Americans. And when I say Americans, I mean the United States and Canada, and that's where they did the research for these methods. Although I've experimented a little bit with values and strategic framing in other countries other than the US and Canada, they seem to be widely shared across the human race. So again, not research tested, just anecdotal. But we did test it. We've come up with 2 values that we can use to help people get into the idea of, why does it matter? So the first one is protection. Protection says that this matters because we have a duty to safeguard the well-being of people and places. There's a lot of ways we can say that. I'll pop them up on the screen. These are just a couple of examples of how we can bring up that idea of protection in our conversation. And I like to say that values should be used early and often. So you want to start with a value somewhere in the beginning of this conversation, but as the conversation continues, you can throw them in every once in a while to really connect people back to that idea of why you should care. So things like showing concern for others is the right thing to do, and taking measures to eliminate or reduce risks, or be vigilant in shielding people and places from harm, protecting and preserving habitats and ecosystems we depend on. All of these things are part of the protection value. Essentially, any synonym for protection or protecting is going to bring up that protection idea. The second value that we use is responsible management. It's similar, but a little bit different. Responsible management brings up the idea that it matters because taking common sense steps today is in the interest of future generations. So this one tends to work especially well for people who are in or are good at business, and parents and grandparents and things like that who are definitely going for future generations. But both of these values work very well for most people most of the time. And that's what our methods are there for. Remember, they started in informal learning centers. So if I'm an informal educator, I don't know my audience, and I get to meet them for maybe 5 minutes and then they're gone. So I don't get a chance to get to know them very well most of the time. So we want to use methods that you don't need to know your audience in order to be effective. Some examples for responsible management look like, let's be responsible when it comes to the environment, or let's look ahead to handle problems before they get worse. Responsible managers keep an open mind, look to evidence, and take a level-headed step-by-step approach. And future generations depend on the decisions that we make today. And these are all ways that we can queue up that responsible management value. Now, again, you don't need to memorize this, or if you're feverishly taking notes, I applaud you. But we have our values and all of our tools that we're discussing today in what we call reframe cards, which are linked in the chat box for you. To get your own swamp and your own reframe cards, feel free to print and use word for word. Normally we talk about plagiarism and citing and all that. Noki's tools are meant to be used word for word. All right, so here's some examples of how you would use a value in a conversation. You can say something like, it's important that we all take responsible steps to manage the issues facing our environment, to leave our planet in good shape for future generations of animals, plants, and people. Or you can say something like many people, we at the park believe in safeguarding people and places from harm for the well-being of animals and people. These are just simple little sentences that you can sprinkle into the beginning of a conversation. And of course, tailor them to meet your needs. If you don't work for a national park, you probably wouldn't say we at the park. But you can say, I believe, or people in my community believe, or something like, hey, we know here in New Jersey that we care about the well-being of our planet for future generations. Things like that are ways you can really work these values into a conversation. Values, I will tell you, was the hardest part for me in training. I just did not get them. And then all of a sudden the light bulb went off and I was like, oh, they're that easy. It's not difficult. You just need to throw in a word: protect, responsible, step by step, future generations, reasonable. These words connected to what you're talking to in order to effectively use a value. All right, so we've discussed, why does this matter? Those are our values: protection, responsible management. Once people are invested in the problem, yeah, climate change is an issue that I care about. I do want to talk more about it. I do want to do something about it. Then we get into our metaphors. How does it work? We have explanatory metaphors and explanatory chains. So both of those tools are going to help us explain the problem a little bit more. All right, taking a look at that image on the, I guess, the right side of the screen, there's a complicated math problem equation going on. Don't even know if it's a real equation. And then there's a complicated answer. And in the middle, it says, then a miracle occurs. It says, I think you should be more explicit here in step number 2. And while this makes a whole lot of sense to us, it may not make as much sense sometimes when we're explaining things like, this is an environmental problem, and this is what we should do about it. We need to make sure that a miracle doesn't occur in the middle of our conversation. We want to connect those pieces so people understand what the problem is, why it's happening, and how that solution is going to affect that problem. So many climate communications focus on the impacts, but they don't really tell you what happens. And without this, people arrive at the wrong solutions. We call that the guessing machine, when they don't have a full understanding, and you'll find yourself doing it too. I do it all the time. I try to stop the guessing machine. Don't do it. When you don't have that full equation, you start plugging in random thoughts and ideas that make it sound like it works or make it sound reasonable, but it's not really the right thing. And we know that people are more likely to act if they understand how it works. So that's why we want to do that. All right, good explanations. Make an abstract idea concrete or sticky. I don't really like the word sticky, but in this sense, it's a good sticky. Help people understand the mechanisms at work. They give people a role in the story, and they link causes and solutions together. All right, so we want to make sure we're connecting those dots and connecting those pieces, but we're also going to use metaphors. And if you're an English nerd like I am a little bit, None of these are actually metaphors, they're similes, but it's okay. We're going to call them metaphors and it's going to be fine. So these 4 metaphors are our 4 tested metaphors for talking about the climate change story. We'll dive into the heat trapping blanket a little bit, so you'll see how that works. But there's also regular versus rampant CO2, the climate's heart, and osteoporosis of the sea. Climate's heart is really good for talking about how the ocean affects our climate when a lot of people can't make those connections, or a lot of people live far away from the ocean and don't understand how protecting the ocean is important to affecting their community. Osteoporosis of the sea is our metaphor for talking about ocean acidification. If you work with kids or anybody under 18, research was not done on anyone under 18 because doing research on children is complicated. But I found that using something like talking about how milk makes strong bones equates to osteoporosis of the sea for kids who don't quite understand what osteoporosis is. But we will talk about the heat trapping blanket. And once you're Noki trained, it's very difficult to say heat trapping blanket without doing this heat trapping blanket. All right. So here's an example of how this works. And it looks like a lot of writing, but remember when you're talking, it takes a little less time. So after you've sprinkled your values into the beginning of the conversation, you might say something like, when we use fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This excess carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere, acting like a heat trapping blanket, warming the air, land, and sea. As ocean water warms, it expands, resulting in much of the sea level rise that we are seeing around the world. Combined with increasingly large storms, we're seeing much of the coast experiencing either erosion or increased flooding. Locally in California, sea level rise is shrinking critical breeding beaches for elephant seals, making young pups more susceptible to being separated from their mothers due to big storms and threatening the homes, roads, and other infrastructure that people in coastal communities depend on. So our heat trapping blanket explains how carbon dioxide in increased amounts is warming our atmosphere, but also the earth itself and the oceans as well. Then we have our sea level rise as our result, what it's doing, and how it's affecting the environment, animals, and people too. Putting all of those things together, we have our big cause at the top. So fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy. We use the term fossil fuels a lot, but we don't always define what fossil fuels are. And not a lot of people know. So remember, it's important to make sure you explain everything. Coal, oil, and natural gas are all fossil fuels. And a lot of the time we talk about natural gas and don't always equate it to being a fossil fuel as well. So we burn those for energy. I want to start with that big problem. We want to add in the metaphor, our heat trapping blanket, so they understand how carbon dioxide works to increase the heat on our planet. Connect the dots. So how does that heat trapping blanket cause problems in climate change? Well, we talked about how warmer water expands, that creates sea level rise, larger storms, flooding coastal areas. That makes sense. And then what's the problem? Well, we're seeing flooding and erosion. That's a problem. And what's at stake? Well, it's definitely damaging for elephant seals, who are super cute and highly dangerous. Don't get too close to them, but super cute. And also threatening local communities as well. So it's not just about animals and the environment. Climate change is also affecting us. So that's what's at stake and what is affecting our communities. So I want to pause right there for just a minute and see so far if you have any questions about values, metaphors, or how are you feeling about these methods so far? feeling very hopeful. Oh, awesome. Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely very matter of fact. Want to make sure that we avoid that crisis-y tone. So you want to just tell it like it is. Yeah, it's really important to connect those stories to people too. Cool, that's awesome. They do, yeah. And the term climate crisis has come up a lot. And at Noki, we absolutely want to avoid that term. We don't like it. Is it happening right now? Absolutely. Do we need to do something about it? Yes. Did we need to do something about it 20 years ago? Yes. But we want to make sure that we take reasonable approach, a reasonable tone. Otherwise, people just tune you out. You don't want that. I also see the question, why do the study circles not occur virtually? Because they're very dependent on that human connection in a study circle. But we do have trainings that occur virtually, and I'll explain those in a little bit. Yeah, there definitely is a sense of urgency in the problem, and I know a lot of people have trouble toning that down. They feel like people are just going to push it back. I trust the science that tells us that this is going to be long lasting, and that's what we really need in order to start working towards the problem. And again, this is for most people most of the time. So if it's something that we want to change a law right now, well, that might need more of an urgent crisis-y tone potentially. But when you're talking to the average human, most of the time, this is what we're going for. Mm-hmm. Yeah, connecting people instead of just animals. Yeah, and that's the hardest part of these conversations sometimes is when you're talking to somebody and you're explaining it and everything's reasonable and they're just like, no. And it's really hard. But sometimes those are the conversations you just need to walk away from. And it sounds difficult and it sounds like you're giving up. But the more that people hear the same thing over and over again in the same way, the more likely they are to react to it. So maybe you were the very first person who brought it up and they're like, absolutely against my beliefs. I don't think I can't do it. That's something that might happen. But then they're going to hear it again and again and again. And just like erosion, it's going to whittle them down. So they'll get to a point where they do agree. It does make sense. It does compute. And we've all experienced that ourselves too. The first time you heard something new, you're like, absolutely, no way. That's not right. And then you hear it again and again, and you do your own research and you do some thinking. And you're like, yeah, that person was right. So it does happen. All right, awesome comments. We're going to move on to even more important, or I guess it's all important, but the solutions. How do we improve the situation? So now hopefully you've got someone to care. They understand how it works. Immediately they're like, great, what do I do? So how do we improve the situation? Well, we know that community doesn't just mean our neighborhood or a town. It could be in lots of different forms. It could be your school. It could be a Facebook group. It could be a book club. It could be a place where you worship. It could be your friends. Community looks different to everyone, and we're all part of multiple communities. So by keeping this in mind, we're broadening our ability to look for good solutions in many different ways that many different people can engage with. So I really like that Goldilocks image. This task feels too big. This task feels too small. This task feels just right. That's what we're going for. We want the Goldilocks solution. Telling everybody climate change is a problem and we need to do something about it. So you should change your light bulbs in your house. That doesn't really fit the scope and the scale of the problem. That doesn't make sense. But climate change is a problem. We need to stop using fossil fuels immediately right now. That's a little too big for me as one person to tackle. So what can we do that's effective but manageable? And that's the solutions that we're looking for. So a properly framed solution steers you away from unproductive parts of the swamp we were talking about earlier. Things like, what can I do? Politics as usual. Even if we do our part, other countries won't. Just big, scary, depressing, crisis. Just clean it up. Nature self-correcting. Things like that. We're going to use our community level solutions to steer away from that. So how do we improve the situation? Well, we can help change the decision-making context so that making the sustainable choice is the easy choice. We want to make sure that the system changes. It's not about your decision to change your light bulbs. It's about your power company supplying clean energy to your house. Community level solutions foster hope and a sense of agency and efficacy. And engagement and hope are really, really important in the solutions portion as well. By framing climate change as a problem that can be addressed at a community level and practical step-by-steps to get there. And we want to be very specific with programs, initiatives, and approaches when we talk about this. So the three types of solutions that we talk about are the energy shift, or moving towards renewable energy efficiency, reducing our demand for fossil fuels, and to talk about it, talk about climate change. All three of these solutions are equally as effective. So even if you can just talk about it, that's just as important as finding a way to reduce our demand on fossil fuels or shifting towards renewable energy. We want to keep solutions collective. It's not about you, it's about us. We like to call that the me to we. We want to do something. It's not just about you. Local and existing stories are really important as well. So we want to talk about something that's already happening that you can become a part of in your community. And it's happening here right now. So while there's some really great solutions going on in California, I don't live in California. So I'm going to talk about what's happening here in Florida. And you can talk about what's happening in New Jersey, or even more locally in your town, in your community, in your school. And those are going to be what's most effective. So one more note on the solutions end. We want to make sure we avoid polarizing language. This was a study done more recently in 2016 and 2017, right after the election. We talked about this a little bit more. So Frameworks jumped back in and studied 4,500 individuals to talk about solutions framing. So words that we tend to stay away from are things like politicians, policies, laws, regulations, and government. And again, this is for most people most of the time. So if you are talking to civic leaders in your government about laws, then you can use those words. But if you're talking to the average person, these words tend to turn them off of the conversation or think more politically polarizing. Climate change is not a political issue. It's an issue that's affecting all of us globally on the planet. So it's important that we work together as a human species who cares about the future of our environment and cares about the future of our communities and the people we care about, to make a big difference. So instead of using things like politicians, we say civic leaders or just leaders, community leaders, I tend to say. Approaches or programs instead of policies or laws, using your specific state or city name that you're talking about instead of regulations and government. So I would say Florida instead of the governor, something like that. Yeah, so just a couple of things to keep in mind as you're having a conversation. All right, solution looks super big, but we're going to break it down. So again, this is after you have talked about you've got your values, you've explained the heat trapping blanket. Now you're moving into solutions. So you might say something like, we at the park are dedicated to working towards handling these problems before they get too big to handle. It's not just us though. Communities around the state have been asking their leaders for better energy options. Community gardens help because they help make climate-friendly foods more accessible and reduce CO2 emissions when transporting vegetables to your grocery store. They are also great at helping us adapt to the intense rainstorms we're getting as an effect of climate change by absorbing the storm water. And they are great places for the community to come together. I bet you're not the only person in your neighborhood that's concerned with the abandoned lots. I would start talking to your neighbors to see who else is interested. The Belle Island Salt Marsh in East Boston was restored because neighbors in the area wanted to keep that area for recreational use and came together to make sure it happened. By talking to your friends and family about how and why you're taking action, you can help us protect current and future generations of seals and people by tackling the source of the problem. This is our giant solution story. So a couple of things you might have noticed in there are referring back to that value. Remember, early and often. Then we want to use that explanatory chain within the solution. So don't just say invest in community gardens or start a community garden. A lot of people aren't going to understand why community gardens are a good thing when it comes to climate change. So we want to connect those dots. There are co-benefits. It's important for the community and the neighborhood, but it's also helping the environment. And a specific example, this would be an example we would use in Boston or Massachusetts in general. What is already happening? So this is something that already happens. And our solution here is talk about it, not reducing or shifting, but talking about it is the important part of this solution. All right, so we've talked about why does it matter? We have our responsible management and protection values. How does it work is our metaphors section and explanatory chains. And how do we improve the solution? Through community level solutions. This is our toolbox for communicating climate change. And study circles are about a 6-month training that you've gotten in about 1 hour. So this isn't the whole story. We want to continue the conversation. So I will take your questions in just a second, but I do want to let you know how to stay involved if this is something that's interesting to you, or if you do have further questions after we're done here today. Our website is NNOCCI.org, NNOCCI.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We need to update the slide, I guess. That's the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation, or NOCCI. And Climate Interpreter is the website we work off of. If you go to climateinterpreter.org, you can set up a profile. You can check and see where all of the Noki ninjas are and find some folks to practice with. And if you want to learn more, if you want to be involved in more in-depth trainings, we do have an all online crash course, which was developed to be all online before that was cool. That is at climateinterpreter.org/training. And you can look into either the crash course or self-guided trainings, or eventually, hopefully within the next year, we'll have study circles going again as well. And all of those trainings are more in depth than the training you've experienced today, and you'll be able to practice what you learn and really solidify that information. And yes, the crash course will start up in the fall. So definitely stick around if you have any questions or comments. We do have some time to answer. We've got about 10 minutes left, I think, to answer those questions. But if you are taking off, if you could take a moment to fill out our evaluation and help us stay scientific, that would be really helpful. That's tinyurl.com/Noki eval. We'd really appreciate that. But of course, I am here, so I'm going to check out the chat box and see what's going on there. I've seen some notifications.
Thank you so much, Cassie. We have some educators on today and some community members. As you can tell, Cassie is not only a fabulous volunteer with Noki's national leadership team, she's also a K-12 educator. So I think that definitely helped us absorb some of the principles that we talked about today. We do have to wrap up because there's another group using our Zoom license at 4:30. I really do hope that that you'll be able to connect with the resources that Cassie talked about. There's a link in the chat for the climate interpreter training, as well as some of those tools that Cassie talked about, the SWAMP list, and also the summary of the framing methods that we talked about. I think this week, this session for the one-on-one coupled with the nonpartisan climate change primer that we did yesterday with Sea Change Conversations are some great starting points for widening your circle, widening your volunteer base in your green team, working with your key decision makers that may have been holding you back from some larger projects in your community. So I'm extremely grateful to you, Cassie, for sharing these tools with us today.
Yeah, and it was so great to be here, and thank you everybody for your participation as well. If you do have any further questions or if you want to stay connected, I'm going to put my email in the chat box, and feel free to reach out since we didn't have a lot of time to answer questions too.
Yeah, again, Cassie took this big, fabulous training that they normally do and squished it into our time frame for us today. They have so much more to offer, and I know that some of you will become very proficient in this, given the opportunity to practice in those circles that she talked about. So